So we'll go on with the program and ask Jan Semenza, professor from Umeå University, previously also with the European Center for Disease Control. So please.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the organizers to be here. It's great to be here. Turns out I grew up in Zurich, and I'm half Italian, so I had an Italian nonna, and every time she came to visit us, she brought these big cans of Nutella with her that we didn't have in Zurich at the time. This was 50 years ago, a long time ago. Obviously now Nutella is everywhere, but I ate that in a second. And so for me to coming back here, I know where I came from. This is incredible. This is like home. So I didn't know that Nutella was born here. And you know, I ate it every day, no more, but I used to. So it's great to be here. So thanks for the invite. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to speak. Today I will speak about climate change in general, on all kinds of different health impacts, and particularly with a focus on elderly populations. And I will also touch on mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases. I know you guys have a lot of things to do. This slide says it all, so if you need to go and do something else, you've seen this slide, then you can go home. Because basically what I will address is, okay guys, time to choose. Heat waves, heavy rains, or West Nile virus. That's all I will cover. I won't talk about anything else, so you're done. You don't need to listen to my talk. You have seen it already. If you want to stick around, you're welcome to. So this is one of these big documents that we produce on a regular basis, the IPCC, where we document the impact of climate change on all kinds of different ecologic systems and human health systems. And this slide here shows greenhouse gas emissions during human activity, and it indicates that they continue to increase. So it's just going up and up and up. And it is kind of puzzling, right, that we can't stop these increased emissions that are just going up continuously. And obviously the majority of it is coming from fossil fuels. I don't know if you can see that, from fossil fuels. And the next slide illustrates why that is. Because it turns out that it's your tax money at work. So this is we publish these yearly reports from the Lancet Countdown, where we track change over time. And this slide indicates how you subsidize fossil fuels. I don't know if you can see that here. This bottom line here illustrates how we taxpayers subsidize the fossil fuel industry, and even more so over the, even more so, going in the wrong direction. More so over the last years. You can see here, what is this due to? This is Ukraine, right? So we had this big energy crisis in Europe, and so we decided to subsidize fossil fuels even more so. It has gone down a little bit, but it's still very strong. And then at the very top, you can see the carbon tax. That's minimal compared to the subsidies that are going into fossil fuels. So it's all your money, your tax money at work to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. And what does that lead to? It leads to these greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that are just skyrocketing to 410 parts per million currently, and the other gases as well. And obviously the temperature is increasing as a result. This is an old slide. Now we have reached an average of 1.5 temperature increase on average. And so this trajectory doesn't look good. It's going up and up and up. Climate change doesn't just impact the icebergs on the poles or elsewhere in Sweden where I live. It also has profound human health implications. And in order to understand the impact on climate change on human health, we need to differentiate three different components: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And those three determinants, they define what the impact on human health will be. So the hazard is the climate hazard. So that's the extreme heat, the extreme precipitation, sea level rise, or all these other climatic hazards. Then vulnerabilities are individual level vulnerabilities, population level vulnerabilities, societal infrastructure vulnerabilities, and so on. And then the exposure is what you get exposed to. And here you can see the temperature, rain, and hazard, which is the climate hazard. You can see these vulnerabilities like advanced age could be a risk factor or a vulnerability factor. Social inequalities between the rich and the poor. Social capital, which is the potential in social networks to help out each other and to work together. And medical conditions. And then the exposures would be being exposed to wildlife, being exposed to unhygienic conditions, contaminated water, or the geography. And that determines the risk in the heart of this Venn diagram. So looking at climate change, you always need to take the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure into account. And throughout my talk, you will see where these different factors play in. The good news is that potentially we can reduce that risk. The terms that we use in the climate field is to reduce the hazard through mitigation. Mitigation is reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Through adaptation, we can reduce vulnerabilities, and through adaptation, we can also reduce the exposures. And we in public health work on adaptation. We call it prevention. We can reduce exposure and vulnerability. And the energy sector can reduce mitigation, but we in public health, we don't do that, and I wish we could, but we don't. And we would like to reduce that risk at the heart of the Venn diagram. So this slide here illustrates some of the human health risk factors or endpoints that we need to consider. And so one thing that we are dealing with climate change is rising temperatures, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and increasing CO2 emissions. So that's at the core of the diagram here. So this is the impact of climate on those determinants. It turns out that these 4 factors can manifest themselves in a number of different environmental endpoints. And air pollution is one of them, and Francesca will speak about air pollution later on. We will see changes in vector ecology. You have all heard about the Asian tiger mosquito, La Zanzara tigre. You know about increasing allergens, water quality, water food supply system, environmental degradation, extreme heat, and severe weather. So these are all these impacts on the environment that have implications for public health. And I find this unfair, but I was only given 45 minutes to go through all this, so I'm not going to be able to go through them all. I'll pick a few, and then I'll come back next year or in 2 years to go through the rest, okay? Deal. Today, I would like to focus on heat-related mortality. And it turns out that I worked at the Centers for Disease Control, which is a big agency in the United States to address public health. And I started a program that's called EIS, Epidemic Intelligence Service, which are field epidemiologists that go out and investigate outbreaks. And so we are shipped out into the field to investigate a sexually transmitted disease outbreak or a foodborne outbreak or environmental pollution or whatever that is. So I started that program, and I was into the program one day, and my supervisor called me at 9 o'clock at night. And she told me, you know, Jan, pack your bag, you're shipped out to Chicago. And why is that? I haven't had my training yet. It was supposed to be a 2-week training. I can't go to Chicago. What do you want me to do there? It turns out that a heat wave has killed 700 people. A heat wave, what is that? This was 30 years ago, 1995. This is a long time ago. I didn't know what heat waves were. Nobody knew what heat waves were. They didn't exist at the time. In fact, I had isolated a heat shock receptor on a molecular level doing cell biology, and now I'm supposed to investigate a heat wave on the macro scale. I didn't know what to do. So they shipped me to Chicago because an inversion had locked in hot air over the city of Chicago in 1995, and they had to bring a cooling truck to the morgue. The morgue is where the medical examiner works, to handle this overflow of dead bodies. They couldn't cope with all these bodies. People were dying like flies, and they had to bring them to the morgue to examine, to do the autopsy, and they had to have a cooling truck to handle this onslaught of dead bodies. And it was all over the news that all these people are dying because of the heat, and it was a big controversy. I don't want to go into details. And we were shipped out to Chicago. My supervisor enforced me to go to Chicago, and we got a very warm welcome. Forecast, warm and friendly. It was so hot and humid. It was incredible. So we basically started doing the epidemiology of what was going on. And this slide here indicates the heat index. Heat index is a combination of humidity and temperature. And you can see that it went up really fast, really quickly. And then after 2-3 days, people started dying. You can see that other curve, this curve here. This is the heat-related mortality that will start going up after 2 or 3 days. And so we enrolled in our study. We conducted 700 interviews. In fact, 700 people had died, with people that died from cardiovascular disease and heat-related mortality on the death certificate. And we had this team of 80 people. We ran this huge case control study. It was the biggest study ever done. In fact, today it's still the biggest. And we identified a lot of underlying risk factors for heat-related mortality, environmental risk factors, biomedical risk factors, social risk factors. It was a multifactorial thing, and we capture everything. But let me focus on one thing, because they only give me 45 minutes. And so let me focus on vulnerability, because Lena will talk about vulnerability later on, and that's our connection. And so here we looked at these social contacts that people had. For example, if you go to church, if you participate in social activities, your risk for heat-related mortality is reduced. So this is the odds ratio, which is like the relative risk. If it's below 1, the risk is reduced. So you are protected if you are embedded in a social network, like a church group or a club. If you had access to transportation, your risk was reduced. If you had friends in Chicago, your risk was reduced by 1/3. Even if you have a pet at home, if you have a dog at home, that reduced your risk. And if you lived alone, your risk was increased. So there was a stark relationship between social isolation. This slide illustrates where people had died during the Chicago heat wave in '95. And this slide illustrates most dramatically what it means to be socially isolated in America. I don't know if you can see what this is. These are caskets of people being brought to mass burial because nobody claimed their body. Nobody knew these people. I remember I was going around trying to identify anyone who knew that man who came home with a brown bag every day where he had his whiskey, he drank, and he died alone in his room. Nobody knew him. He died like this. This is the tragedy of social isolation in America. This is what it means to be socially isolated in America. And it was a huge wake-up call to intervene. So based on that information from our investigation, we built heat health action plans. We now knew that the heat can be forecast a week in advance. So you come up with a warning in a week in advance, and you conduct outreach to those vulnerable people with a phone bank, who you need to contact, how you reach them. You tell neighbors, look after your neighbor that needs your help during these heat waves. And you set up action by fanning out your social workers, your neighbors, your volunteers to look after the elderly, the vulnerable that need your help. So this intervention reduced heat-related mortality in the United States, and we haven't had an event like this since. Unfortunately, in 2003, an extreme heat wave happened in Europe, and you can see that this was a complete statistical outlier. So this was the summer 2003. A lot of people remember that, I'm sure. This was the average, so this is the Gauss curve of normal heat waves, summer months, and you can see that it was an extremely hot summer, and so we had something like 70,000 people that died in Europe during 2003. So the Europeans learned from the Americans, and they set up the same heat health action plans like we had developed in the United States. This is from Euro, the European WHO office, with the same forecasts, risk conditions, alert, dissemination alerts, communication, same thing. And as a result, heat-related mortality was reduced in Europe. So this is all good news. And what came next? It turns out that climate change, in combination with aging of the population, increased the risk for populations in Europe. So this is, again, from our Lancet Countdown Europe, which is a different enterprise. I'm the co-chair of this one here. This is such a European Lancet Countdown, and we track these type of changes over time. And you can see how the combination of an aging population and heat or hot days over time has increased dramatically compared to a baseline. So we take a baseline and look how that changes over time, and you can see that there is like a 97 relative increase in the total number of person days of heat wave exposure, in this case of elderly populations. And now here's the bad news, if you don't think that was bad enough. Anyway, this is the bad news for Europe. It turns out that 2022 was the hottest year ever reported in Europe. And as a result, you can see that the heat-related mortality for elderly individuals, 75 plus, increased dramatically, specifically in Spain, the northern part of Italy, where we are right now, but throughout the southern part of Europe in general. And it turns out that more than 60,000 people died in 2022 as a result of that heat wave, or that hot summer. And this is the way we do this. This is a colleague of mine in Barcelona who does this work, Ballester, who has calculated, he takes all deaths of Europe and applies an exposure response curve to all these deaths to estimate how many people died. So this is based on estimates. And based on the best science, we estimate more than 60,000 people died during 2022. Guess what happened 23? The hottest summer ever experienced in Europe, exceeded even 2022. And what happened in 23? You can see that a lot of people died in that year, also, again, in the southern part of Europe. In this case, it was something like 50,000 people. And then last year, the hottest year ever reported, and again, 60,000 people that died, but now it's shifted to the east. So here, we had a risk in Western Europe. Now the risk has shifted over to southern part of Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. But again, more than 60,000 people died. This slide here illustrates that Italy is most affected by these type of heat waves, with thousands of people that die during those extreme years. And here the total for, so there are more countries here that I didn't add. So the total is more than 70, more than 50, more than 60,000 people during those extreme years. In summary, so even 2024 was an extreme year with more than 60,000 people. In total, over those last 3 years, we had like 180,000 people that died. And we obviously need to improve our heat health action plans because they work, but they don't work good enough. So something needs to be done. And the question is, what do we do about it? This is a policy issue. Nobody has to die from heat-related mortality. It's entirely, totally preventable. And so if we come up with the right policies, if we organize ourselves like you organize here in this foundation by having services for the elderly, this can be prevented. This model needs to be replicated in other parts of Italy and in southern Europe in particular, because we need to address this unmet medical need. Something can be done about it and should be done about it. The next one is injuries and fatalities that I would like to touch on. And it turns out that heat is just one aspect. It turns out that we see more and more of these extreme precipitation events as well, so extreme rains. And so in this case, we can see that areas that have an extreme rain event has gone up like 64%. This is now the global answer countdown again. We see more and more areas that experience extreme rain. And this is just one example. I don't know if you remember this in July 2021, where in Northern Europe, Belgium and Germany, there was this extreme precipitation event illustrated in the gauge meter of these rivers. You can see that the river just started flooding because of this extreme rain, and more than 240 people died in Belgium and Germany as a result. And when they computed the contribution of climate change to this, they estimate that it was 9 times more likely because of climate change. And obviously that is a huge issue for injuries, mortality, and mental health issues if your house gets washed away. The next topic is an infectious disease example, how climate impacts mosquitoes, and you are familiar with this animal here. It's the most dangerous animal in the world. So forget about tigers and lions. This is the one that kills more people than any other wild animal. It's the most dangerous animal around. It was introduced in Italy in 1990 in used car tires from Georgia in the US. And then they started propagating in Italy, it moved into France and Spain and Croatia and so on. And it turns out that the climatic suitability for this mosquito has improved dramatically. So again, this one here is the Lancet countdown. This was just published last month. It's hot off the press. I can feel it. It just came out. And you can see that the climatic suitability, this warming, has improved the climatic conditions for this mosquito, specifically the Asian tiger mosquito, which is the blue curve. Aedes aegypti, which is the red curve, has improved also. But here in Europe, we have the Asian tiger mosquito, and that's the one that shows this dramatic improvement in climatic suitability for this mosquito. But it's not just climate. It turns out we all travel a lot, and a lot of people come into Europe from all over the world, and that is potentially a problem if we have tourists that go to Brazil or Thailand and get exposed to a local mosquito that's contaminated with the virus, like dengue or chikungunya or Zika, and then they fly back to Europe within that viremic period when you have a high viral load in your blood, and you get bitten by your local mosquito here in Italy, and that's how you can start a local outbreak. So this population movement is a factor also. It's not just climate, it's also population movement. It turns out that this illustrates passenger volume of people coming into Europe that you don't see. So this is the origin country that comes into the destination countries in Europe. I don't know if you can recognize Europe on this map. This is the passenger volume that comes into here. This in here is Rome, Barcelona, Madrid, Paris, and so on. This is the passenger volume that's coming in. And guess what? It's not only we people, it's not only humans that travel. It turns out our friend, the mosquito, they travel too. Where do you want to go? Mountains, forest, beach, or the city? I don't care, as long as it's warm. It turns out mosquitoes don't travel far, but they hitchhike. They jump onto a car, a truck, a van, or something, and they travel along transportation corridors. They go along the highways and they spread from there. And so the mosquitoes, they travel too. And this slide here illustrates this massive expansion of this invasive species, the Asian tiger mosquito. It didn't exist here before, and it arrived in Italy in the 90s, as you can see up there. This is not a 5-year span, 90 to 94, where it was detected in Italy, and then it invaded the Italian peninsula, the southern part of France, Spain, and has been moving north ever since. And if you look at the different districts in Italy, for example, in 95, you had 20 administrative districts that were impacted, 36. In 2020, it was 100% of Italy has been invaded by this mosquito. So this mosquito is expanding dramatically. And the question is, what does that do? This is what it does. This mosquito transmits chikungunya or dengue, which are dangerous tropical diseases that are a hazard to public health. And we are located here, as you all know, in this gray zone. But guess what? You're being circled in from both sides. And eventually, I predict, we will have an outbreak here too. So all these areas are areas that have had dengue outbreaks over the last 10, 15 years or so. And so what we looked at is this exponential increase in cases in Europe. And I don't know if you have seen an exponential curve. Well, this is one. So you see the number of cases, it just goes up and up and up. So these are our data from this analysis that we did that looked at these cases. And here we looked at the districts that are now impacted by these type of outbreaks. And again, you see this massive outbreak in this district as well, an exponential curve. We asked the question, how long does it take for an area to be infested with a mosquito until we have the first dengue, chikungunya, or arbovirus outbreak? How long does it take? It turns out that in the 90s, so a long time ago, 35 years ago or so, it took something like 25 years until we had the first outbreaks, right? So a mosquito arrives in a district, like in a district in Italy in the 90s, and then it takes 25 years for the first outbreak to occur. The problem is that time has collapsed to 5 years. So the mosquito now arrives in a new district, and now it takes 5 years for the first outbreak to occur. It turns out that the mosquito causes an outbreak in one district, here in 2000, whatever it is, and that time has now decreased dramatically as well until the second outbreak occurs. So it just multiplies, it goes faster and faster. And so we basically set up this analysis, a time to event analysis, where we looked at all the different factors that contribute to these type of outbreaks. And we can see that these outbreaks happen more likely in urban areas. Every single imported case from Brazil or Thailand increases the risk for a local outbreak. We call this autochthonous transmission, increases by 8%. Health expenditures increases the risk. So if you have a district that spends 100 euros on health, their risk for an outbreak increases by 20%. Does that make sense? I don't understand. So if you invest more money, we have more outbreaks? That doesn't make sense. Do you know what this is? How do you explain that? Why do we have more outbreaks? A 20% increase for every 100 euros we invest for health doesn't make any sense. It's better surveillance, right? If you have better surveillance because you invest in your health system, because you can detect it, you're more likely to see it, right? In Croatia, there was a case in 2010. They didn't figure it out until a tourist went to Germany, was diagnosed. They went back and discovered a big outbreak. And then here, of course, temperature, mean temperature increases the risk. 1 degree increase in mean temperature increases the risk by 55%. Let me know when it's 18 degrees or higher. Mosquitoes are cold-blooded. They can't heat themselves like we can. They need to have a warm environment. So it's kind of cut off there, but we looked at warm districts compared to cold districts. So we stratified them by 20 degrees, and we looked at the warmer districts and colder districts, and the warmer districts are more likely to have an outbreak compared to the colder districts. So those two curves separate very quickly, and you are more likely to have an outbreak in a warmer district compared to a colder district. We also looked at the northward expansion. It turns out, this is a busy slide, but here, this line here establishes how Aedes albopictus, the mosquito, is moving north. It turns out it moves 60 kilometers a year. It's moving further north. It doesn't move on its own, right? It transports on cars and everything. And then we asked, how about number of cases? It turns out that we found this quadratic relationship between outbreaks and distance, and it moves up 120 kilometers a year. So it moves even faster. So these outbreaks move even faster than the mosquito. And it turns out that increases the population at risk dramatically. And then, of course, we do the climate projection. We project that forward in time. Here we have the temperature that increases, the summer temperature, and the risk for these type of outbreaks, which is going up and up and up. So basically, what's your assessment? You have a new district that's never had a dengue outbreak in the past. People don't expect to have a dengue outbreak. We need surveillance in those areas that we have identified to be affected in the future. Otherwise, you're never going to be picking it up. We need better disease surveillance. So here's the summary. The mean temperature, 1 degree, increases the risk by 55%. Warmer regions are increased risk. We see a 5-fold increased risk in the future from these type of outbreaks. And it looks like we are going from sporadic or occasional outbreaks to an endemic situation. It could be that if you want to go to Italy on vacation, you might need a vaccine. That's the bad news from this slide. Okay, let's move on to water. Water is another important issue, not according to this guy here, but waterborne outbreaks are of big concern for public health as well. And it turns out that heat waves are one thing, but marine heat waves are another issue. The oceans absorb 90% of the heat, and they're getting warmer and warmer. You can see the Mediterranean in the top right corner. This was a marine heat wave. It turns out that when the water is warm, it tends to evaporate, and that's illustrated here. There is more evaporation from the oceans, so there is more humidity in the air. Once there is more humidity in the air, it has to come down, and you can see it condenses, and you have these extreme precipitation events that leads to runoff and infiltration into the aquifer. And guess what? This diagram now becomes more complicated because it turns out that a little rain event can now impact a house that was built in a floodplain, so it gets flooded, and then suddenly you have that house that's being inundated by water, but now suddenly the rats come out and they pee in the water, and you have leptospirosis outbreaks, you have standing water for mosquitoes, you have coliform contamination. So all kinds of other things can happen. And I call these cascading risk pathways where one thing leads to another. And here, in this case, suddenly elderly individuals get exposed to enterococci or coliform because they were exposed to floodwater, and then they are exposed in their homes because the water is contaminated, and then they are more at risk. And so this is the secondary risk pathways. And let me just give you an example how that looks. So let's say heavy rain leads to storm runoff, mobilizes pathogens, and then leads to waterborne outbreaks. And let's look at this example here. So in the very top left corner, you have this extreme rain event, and we looked at that epidemiologically. So we took all waterborne outbreaks in Scandinavia, and we looked at the preceding climatic conditions to all these type of outbreaks. And so we looked at heavy precipitation events before that outbreak. So the heavy precipitation events, 95% percentile, and we saw a threefold increased risk for waterborne outbreaks if it was preceded by an extreme rain event. So these rain events cause extreme precipitation events. So the question is, what do we do about that, right? So how do we tackle that? And on this diagram here, I broke down the climate hazard again that we mentioned earlier, in this case extreme rain, against exposure and against the vulnerability as part of this cube of the disease burden. And here I would like to reduce that disease burden through mitigation and adaptation to reduce the public health burden from waterborne diseases. And it turns out there are a lot of things we can do about this. For mitigation, we can do a lot of stuff by efficiency interventions, renewable energy, and so on. We can use a lot of strategies to reduce the exposure by better hygiene system and sewer systems, better surveillance systems like wastewater monitoring regulations. We can also reduce the vulnerabilities to this system. So there are a lot of things that we can do to reduce the risk from waterborne diseases, and this paper here has a whole list of different strategies for different sectors to consider to intervene against these type of risks. So we are getting towards the end, and just, I don't know if you feel depressed about all this, but I have a good example at the very end that's going to make you feel better. So hang on there. So I will touch on migration. And it turns out that on the top here we have all these climate exposures and then the risks. It turns out that climate change impacts people in their origin country, people that are in transit, and people at the destination country, right? And so climate has a differential impact on depending where people are, and that climate impact impacts their decision whether they should stay home or move to Italy to find a better life. And there's actually some evidence for this. I don't know if this is a great example because it's not necessarily causal, but here this PNAS paper looked at the climatic conditions in Syria prior to 2015. Do you remember 2015 when 1 million Syrians came to Europe? So they analyzed the climate conditions that were due to climate change in the Fertile Crescent, and they saw that the winter rainfall had decreased in that area dramatically. They showed that the annual surface temperature had increased dramatically in that area prior to 2025. And then this drought index went the wrong way as well. So it turns out, and I don't know if this is causal, but they claim to some extent that because of these extreme climatic conditions, people were moved out from their countryside into the cities because they couldn't make a living. And so then, because they moved into the city, there was civil strife, conflict, and the war in Syria erupted, and we were all impacted by that event. If this is entirely causal, I don't know. It might be an association, but it's interesting. This is even more interesting. It turns out that if you look at temperatures in the origin countries, so if you look at Afghanistan, if you look at Pakistan and India, And if you look at the temperature deviation from the optimal growing temperature, so you have growing temperature where you can grow wheat and crops, and if it's too hot, we see more applications in Europe for psyllium. So it turns out that here, once the temperature is optimal to grow wheat, people don't apply for psyllium, they don't move. But once you deviate and it gets hotter, people start moving. And again, right, this is intriguing. If it's true, I don't know, but there seems to be a relationship between the temperature in the origin country and whether people decide to apply for psyllium or not. And obviously that has huge implications for us. You all remember this, right? This is a tragic event. They called it the Exodus. And what do we do about this, right? I mean, how do we tackle this? And now I would like to come to the positive example. How do we use data for public health purposes, and how do we turn this around? And I told you I'm Swiss, and I would like to mention a Swiss example that I'm proud of. I'm also Swedish. There's another Swedish example, Greta Thunberg, who started the biggest world movement that we know of in our times, comparable to Jesus Christ, I might say. Unfortunately, you know, COVID put a stop to a lot of that, but she started this youth movement about climate change. But this is now a Swiss example. And it turns out that these Swiss women, illustrated here on this Nature paper, decided to do something about climate change. It turns out that they are at increased risk for heat waves, as I mentioned earlier, right? Remember the heat wave in Chicago? Elderly women were at increased risk. They are less able to regulate the temperature due to impaired thermoregulation. Elderly people are more isolated than men because they live longer than men, because they are the superior sex. Then more likely to suffer from pre-existing medical conditions because they are elderly. They're depressed from being shut at home due to the heat. They're sequestered from friends and family due to the heat. And they're affected by sleep due to heat. In fact, in the Lancet Countdown that just came out last week, we showed the impact of heat on insomnia and poor heat. You might want to check that out. And then it impacts the daily activities. So these Swiss citizens, the Klimasenioren, met 10 years ago or so and decided to sue the Swiss government, to my delight. And the request was dismissed, right? What do you expect from the Swiss, right? That's what they do. And so they appealed the decision, and they appealed the court decision that came down. Guess what? It was dismissed, right? That's what the Swiss do best. And then they appealed, they took it to the Supreme Court in Switzerland. And what happened? They lost the case. It was dismissed. I told you, that's what the Swiss do best, right? So ignore responsibility. And so they decided to submit their application to the European Court of Human Rights, with, which not only accelerated their case, it put it into the big chamber. And there were something like 2,000 elderly women that sued, and they brought this issue that climate is a human right. They used all the evidence that we had produced in Chicago, in the IPCC, in the Lancet Countdown, to use against the Swiss government, and in this case, at the Court of Human Rights, and that Switzerland had violated their right for climate protection because the Swiss didn't want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and the Swiss were trying to buy themselves out of it, because one thing that the Swiss have is money, and they're planning to buy and build, plant trees in Brazil or whatever they were trying to do. They didn't want to take responsibility themselves, and that was a human rights crisis, and it was their legal duty to respond to that. And eventually they won, and it set a precedent for a lot of other countries, and the Swiss citizens pushed the Swiss government into the corner and forced the government to do something about this. And so my call to you is use evidence-based litigation as a strategy to push back. It's all up in our court to fight back. I'm in lawsuits involved. I support these kind of initiatives. A lot of things can be done through the legal way. And in conclusion, so heat is a killer, and we discussed earlier whether air pollution has a bigger impact on health than heat wave. It turns out that in climate science, the attribution of the impact of climate change on human health is very difficult. But now with these new tools, you have more and more evidence that these impacts are huge. We cannot have 60,000 people die every year due to the heat if it is preventable. And so that evidence is now coming in, and I bet it will outcompete air pollution in the future. For us here in Italy right now, these sporadic outbreaks, these occasional outbreaks of dengue or chikungunya will become a systemic problem with more and more outbreaks that will look similar, like an endemic situation. For water outbreaks, we see these cascading risk pathways where we have vulnerable infrastructure that's at risk from these impacts. And then the answer will be to conduct science-based climate litigation or evidence-based litigation, use the evidence that has been produced. And a call to all of us, approach the vulnerable. Can we do that? And ensure equitable provision of care to those who need it most. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jan. We're lagging a little bit behind time.
I'm sorry, taking up too much time. Thank you for that.
You're so enthusiastic, but we can have a couple of questions.
Il professor Semenza comprende e parla benissimo italiano, quindi non abbiamo dei timori, poniamo la domanda in italiano.
Questo lo faccio in inglese, in italiano non ce lo farò, mi dispiace.
Grazie, molto chiaro.
Grazie.
Quanto le politiche, non solo italiane, ma mondiali, mirano alla protezione dello stato sociale? Esempio, prima c'erano politiche sanitarie sulla tutela della salute collettiva e individuale, stiamo andando di nuovo solo sulla collettiva, di nuovo sul principio filosofico del liberalismo. Quindi siamo di nuovo a 800, non a 2025. E quindi rispetto, per esempio, è chiaro che è tutta una catena per cui anche le infezioni da dengue, zika virus, eccetera, sono dovute ad altro, questo è chiarissimo. Però quanto, se vedo l'Italia, viene fatto sia a livello territoriale e nazionale per prevenire, cioè sia a livello di educazione sia a livello di... Cioè in Italia l'isolamento da malaria è stato fatto durante l'epoca fascista, no? Prevenzione, non più dopo. Cioè è solo territoriale qualche minimo rimedio. A livello mondiale cosa succede? Grazie.
Yeah, in fact, not much, right? So right now we have the COP meeting, and all these countries come together to reduce reduction in greenhouse gas emissions during these COP meetings, and they have been completely, totally co-opted by fossil fuel industry, and so there's very little that comes out of that. I think that a solution has to come from citizens like yourself, but also from businesses. It turns out that China has had an incredible improvement in their greenhouse gas emissions because they produce all the solar panels and electric batteries and cars that are solutions to this crisis. And so the solution has to come from either business, social groups, faith-based organizations, and we basically need to organize ourselves in order to take this on because the solutions will not come from these multinational organizations, unfortunately.
So I think we need to move on. Thank you, Jan. And